What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks into what should be a routine morning interview, only to find himself stepping into a storm he never saw coming? What happens when the bright studio lights meant to flatter suddenly feel like interrogation lamps, when polite smiles mask sharpened blades, and when, in less than 34 seconds, a morning show transforms into a battlefield? That morning at Today, everything looked exactly as it always did. The studio glowed in warm amber tones. The signature orange couch sat perfectly centered beneath an arc of suspended lights. Coffee mugs steamed gently on the glass table, catching reflections of camera rigs gliding silently across polished floors. Beyond the cameras, the live audience radiated anticipation, soft chatter, nervous laughter, the low hum of pre-show excitement. It was the kind of controlled chaos that only live television could orchestrate. And then he walked in. Pedro Pascal entered with that familiar warmth that had made him one of the most adored actors of the decade. Relaxed shoulders. Easy smile. A wave to the crowd that wasn't rehearsed but instinctive. He looked comfortable, like a man ready to talk about art, passion, storytelling. He had come to promote his latest film, a project critics were already praising for its emotional depth. He expected questions about the craft, about character preparation, maybe a lighthearted anecdote about behind-the-scenes mishaps. That was the script. That was the rhythm of morning television. Across from him sat Savannah Guthrie, posture upright, cue cards neatly stacked on her lap. Her smile was flawless. Polished. Broadcast perfect. Beside her, Hoda Kotb leaned slightly forward, hands folded, offering the kind of open body language that put guests at ease. Off to the side, standing near the weather display, Al Roker chatted quietly with a crew member, waiting for his next segment. At the news desk, Craig Melvin reviewed notes, occasionally glancing toward the couch. Everything was normal. Too normal. Pedro, thank you for being here, Savannah began, voice smooth and practiced, her eyes trained on him with professional precision. We're excited to have you. Pedro's smile widened. Thank you for having me. Always happy to be here. The audience responded with gentle applause. A safe beginning. A predictable rhythm. But something shifted. It was subtle at first, the tightening of Savannah's jaw, the faint narrowing of her eyes. A micro-expression that cameras almost missed. Her fingers tapped once against her cue cards. Not nerves. Calculation. You know, she continued, leaning forward slightly, just enough to invade space without appearing aggressive, there's been a lot of talk recently about some of your comments regarding the industry. Pedro blinked once. Still smiling. Some people, she added, her tone sharpening by a fraction, are saying you've become, well, difficult to work with. The air changed. It was almost physical, like someone had opened a freezer door inside the studio. Audience members shifted in their seats. A cough echoed louder than it should have. Even the overhead lights seemed harsher now, bleaching warmth from the scene. Pedro's smile didn't disappear, but it paused. Suspended. His brow furrowed slightly. I'm sorry, he said calmly. What comments are you referring to? Savannah waved her hand lightly, dismissively. Oh, come on. The interviews where you've criticized production practices. The way you've spoken about directors. It comes across as ungrateful, don't you think? A murmur rippled through the audience. Pedro inhaled slowly. Inside his mind, a quiet recalibration began. This wasn't the usual setup. There was no gentle lead-in, no context. Just accusation wrapped in politeness. I've spoken about safe working conditions, he replied evenly. And about respecting crew members. I don't see how that's ungrateful. Savannah tilted her head. A small smile, but not kind. But you're an actor, she said. Your job is to show up, say your lines, collect your paycheck. Why make everything political? There it was. The first blade. Behind the cameras, a producer stiffened. Hoda shifted in her seat, her lips parting slightly as if preparing to interject, then hesitating. Pedro's hands, resting casually on his knee moments ago, now clasped together. Not defensive. Grounded. "I don't think advocating for basic decency is political," he said. His voice remained calm, but something firmer settled beneath it. Al Roker stepped a few feet closer from his weather station, sensing turbulence before it fully formed. "I heard the action sequences in the film are incredible," Al offered lightly. "Maybe we can talk about, Al," Savannah cut in sharply. "I've got this." The temperature dropped another degree. Pedro felt it now, unmistakably. This wasn't curiosity. It wasn't journalism seeking clarity. It was confrontation. Savannah leaned in again. "You come from a different background than most actors in Hollywood," she said slowly. "Some would say you should be more grateful for the opportunities you've been given." A silence so complete fell over the studio that even the hum of lighting rigs seemed to disappear. Pedro's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you trying to say?" he asked. Her smile sharpened. "I'm saying maybe someone in your position should think twice before biting the hand that feeds them." The audience gasped. And then she delivered it, the line that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. "It certainly helps," she added sweetly, "when you fit a certain diversity quota Hollywood seems obsessed with." Time stopped. Hoda's mouth opened in visible shock. Al's face darkened instantly. Craig looked up from the desk, disbelief written plainly across his features. Pedro didn't move. For a fraction of a second, he felt heat surge behind his ribs, anger, yes, but also clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are. "I'm going to give you one chance," he said quietly, standing up slowly. "To apologize." Savannah laughed. Sharp. Echoing. "For what?" "Telling the truth." And just like that, the interview was no longer an interview. It was war. The audience sat frozen, caught between horror and anticipation. Crew members exchanged glances that silently asked the same question: is this really happening? Savannah rose to her feet as well, matching Pedro's height with defiance rather than professionalism. "You're too sensitive," she said. "You can't handle a real conversation." "A real conversation," Pedro replied, his voice gaining steel, "doesn't involve racist implications." That word, racist, landed heavy. The control room erupted in whispers and frantic gestures. Should they cut to commercial? Should they ride it out? No one moved. Because what was unfolding wasn't just conflict. It was exposure. Savannah's composure began to fracture at the edges, tiny cracks in the polished facade. Her hands trembled, though she tried to hide it by adjusting her cue cards. "You're twisting my words," she snapped. "Your words don't need twisting," Pedro said. Behind them, the audience's silence turned electric. Not passive anymore. Charged. Hoda finally stood up, placing herself subtly between them. "Okay," she said carefully. "Let's just take a breath." But Savannah wasn't breathing. She was escalating. "You threw a tantrum on your last set," she continued, eyes blazing. "I heard you made a crew member cry." Pedro's expression hardened completely now. "That's a lie." "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm calling your sources liars," he said evenly. "And if you repeat lies without verifying them, that's on you." The crowd reacted audibly this time, a mix of gasps and scattered applause. Savannah's face flushed. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I've interviewed presidents." "And yet," Pedro replied quietly, "you're behaving like this." The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They landed with precision. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. The audience shifted. Not physically, emotionally. The warmth they'd felt toward the show began tilting, toward him. Savannah sensed it. And that's when her tone changed again, from confidence to desperation wrapped in aggression. "You're just an actor," she spat. "You play dress-up for a living." Pedro exhaled. "I have more integrity than you're showing right now." A beat. A long, suffocating beat. The camera zoomed slightly closer, catching every flicker of expression, every tightening muscle. This was no longer a segment. This was a live unraveling. And as Savannah opened her mouth to fire back, something darker, sharper forming behind her eyes, Pedro reached for his microphone. Slowly. Deliberately. The audience leaned forward collectively. Was he about to walk out? The red recording light blinked above camera 3. Still live. Still broadcasting. And just as his fingers brushed the mic pack at his waist, Savannah said something that would push everything past the point of no return. The studio didn't breathe. Not the audience. Not the crew. Not even the hosts who had shared that orange couch for years beneath the glowing lights of today. Everything felt suspended in a single, fragile second. Pedro's fingers rested on the microphone pack clipped at his waist, the small black device suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. Across from him, Savannah Guthrie stood rigid, chin lifted, eyes sharp with something that no longer resembled journalistic curiosity. It looked like defiance. And then she said it. "If you're going to walk out," Savannah continued, her voice ringing louder now, echoing off polished studio floors, "just remember, people are starting to see who you really are." A murmur rippled through the audience. Pedro slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers. His face had changed. The warmth that once defined his presence was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost surgical. "What exactly do you think people are seeing?" he asked quietly. Savannah didn't hesitate. "They're seeing someone who plays the victim whenever he's challenged. Someone who hides behind buzzwords like decency and respect, but can't handle scrutiny." There it was again, the blade disguised as commentary. To Savannah, it was control. To Pedro, it was clarity. Behind them, Hoda Kotb shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her usual warmth had been replaced with visible concern. Her eyes flicked toward the control room window, where producers were pressed against the glass, gesturing urgently. To the side, Al Roker crossed his arms, jaw clenched. He had seen difficult interviews before. He had navigated tense political panels, live weather disasters, breaking news chaos. But this? This felt personal. Pedro removed the microphone from his collar slowly, carefully, as if the act itself required composure. The tiny click as the mic detached seemed amplified in the silence. "I didn't come here to fight," he said. "I came here to talk about a film. A story. Something I care about." Savannah let out a short laugh, thin and humorless. "And instead you got real questions." "No," Pedro replied. "I got accusations." A beat. "You implied my career was handed to me because of diversity quotas," he continued, voice steady but firm. "You repeated unverified rumors. You dismissed my entire profession. That's not journalism. That's character assassination." The audience began clapping. Not loud at first. But growing. Savannah's eyes darted toward them, and for the first time, something flickered beneath her composure. Uncertainty. "Oh, so now we're playing to the crowd," she said bitterly. "Is that what this is?" "No," Craig Melvin finally interjected, stepping forward from the news desk. His voice was calm, but firm. "They're responding to what they just heard." Savannah turned on him instantly. "Stay out of this, Craig." "It stopped being just you and him," Craig replied, "when you made it personal." The temperature in the studio felt 10 degrees colder. Pedro watched her carefully now. He could see it, the unraveling. The loss of narrative control. The shift from calculated aggression to emotional reaction. Inside his mind, a quiet realization settled. She hadn't expected pushback. She hadn't expected witnesses to speak. Savannah took a step closer. "You can't handle a strong woman asking tough questions," she snapped. "That's what this is really about. Your fragile ego can't take it." A collective gasp cut through the air. Hoda's hand flew to her mouth. "Savannah," but it was too late. Pedro closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but restraint. When he opened them again, his voice was lower. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't do what?" she shot back. "Don't turn this into something it isn't just because you're losing control of it." The words landed hard. Savannah's cheeks flushed deeper red. "You're in my studio," she said, almost trembling now. "You don't get to tell me what control looks like." "Your studio?" Hoda echoed, disbelief in her voice. Savannah ignored her. Pedro exhaled slowly. "I've worked for decades," he said. "Auditioned. Failed. Struggled. Survived. I wasn't handed anything. And I won't stand here while you reduce that journey to a quota." Applause again. Stronger. This time, sustained. The sound filled the studio like a rising tide. Savannah's eyes darted toward the cameras, the red tally lights still glowing. Millions watching. And something in her snapped. "Security," she called sharply, without breaking eye contact with Pedro. "Don't let him leave the building." Everything froze. Even the applause died instantly. Pedro turned slowly. "Did you just try to have me detained?" he asked, voice dangerously calm. "You're disrupting a live broadcast," Savannah insisted, but the confidence had cracked. Al stepped forward immediately. "He has every right to leave," Al said firmly. "We don't hold guests hostage." The audience erupted in shocked whispers. Behind the glass, a senior producer pressed a headset to her ear, shouting unheard instructions. Another producer slammed a hand against the console. Cut to commercial. Stay live. This was no longer a tense interview. This was implosion. Savannah looked around, at Hoda's stunned expression, at Craig's disapproval, at AL's protective stance. For the first time, she realized she was alone. "You're all taking his side," she demanded. "This isn't about sides," Craig replied. "It's about what just happened." Pedro unclipped the mic pack completely and handed it to a nearby production assistant. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she took it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave her a small nod. Then he faced Savannah one final time. "You started this with an agenda," he said quietly. "You had a narrative before I even sat down." "I did not," she protested. "You did," he replied. "And when that narrative fell apart, you doubled down." Her hands shook visibly now. "I've interviewed presidents," she snapped. "World leaders. People who matter. And yet," Pedro said softly, "this is how you chose to conduct yourself." The words didn't shout. They cut. Hoda stepped closer to Pedro, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't owe anyone anything else," she said. He nodded slightly. But before he could turn away again, Savannah delivered one final blow, desperate, reckless. "You think you're morally superior," she demanded. "You think you're better than everyone here?" Pedro paused. "No," he said. "I just know how to treat people with basic respect." Silence. Heavy. Then, from off-camera, a new voice cut through the tension. "Savannah." An executive producer stepped onto the set, something that never happened during live broadcast. "Step away from the desk." Savannah's face went pale. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," the producer replied. "We're going to commercial." The audience began clapping again, not celebratory, but stunned. Savannah looked around wildly. "I'm the lead anchor," she insisted. "I'm the face of this show." "And you just damaged it," the producer said bluntly. Pedro watched quietly. There was no triumph in his eyes. Only exhaustion. "I didn't want this," he said softly. "I just wanted to talk about my film." Hoda's voice trembled. "We know." Al shook his head slowly. "This should never have happened." Savannah, being guided away from the desk, pointed at Pedro. "This isn't over," she said. Pedro met her gaze steadily. "Yes," he replied. "It is." The director finally shouted from the control room. "Cut to commercial. Now." The screen faded to ads. But in the studio, chaos remained. Crew members rushed forward. Producers surrounded Savannah. Audience members whispered frantically. Pedro stood still for one long second, absorbing it all. The bright lights. The orange couch. The battlefield it had become. Then he turned toward the exit. Each step deliberate. Measured. Behind him, Savannah's voice rose again, but this time it sounded smaller. Distant. As he reached the door, he paused. The studio lights reflected in his eyes one last time. And that's when something unexpected happened. The audience stood. Not in applause. But in solidarity. A quiet, unified gesture. Pedro nodded once, gratitude without spectacle. Then he walked through the door. And the elevator waited at the end of the hallway. But what happened after those doors closed? What happened inside the control room? And what consequences were already unfolding behind the scenes? That was the part no one at home could see. And it would change everything. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft metallic whisper. For the first time in nearly 30 minutes, there were no studio lights blazing into his eyes. No red tally lights. No accusatory voice cutting through rehearsed pleasantries. Just the low hum of machinery descending floor by floor. Pedro Pascal stood alone inside the mirrored box, shoulders rising and falling as adrenaline slowly loosened its grip. His reflection stared back at him, not the charming late-night guest, not the red carpet favorite, but a man who had just walked through fire on live television. Floor 12. Floor 11. He replayed it all in fragments. The tightening of her smile. The word, quota. The attempt to call security. He hadn't planned to make a stand that morning. He had planned to talk about art. About storytelling. About the small human details that made his new film meaningful. Instead, he had been forced to defend his existence. The elevator chimed softly at the ground floor. The doors opened. Outside, the hallway buzzed with stunned whispers. Production assistants clutched clipboards like shields. A camera operator leaned against the wall, eyes wide, replaying the moment in his mind. Pedro walked through it all with quiet composure. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just steady. Behind him, several floors above, the studio of today was no longer a polished broadcast machine. It was chaos. The control room looked like a command center during a crisis. Headsets overlapped with frantic instructions. Screens replayed clips from seconds earlier, Savannah's words frozen mid-sentence, Pedro's calm rebuttal looping in silent repetition. An executive producer rubbed his temples. "This is already trending," someone muttered, staring at a tablet where social media feeds refreshed faster than anyone could process. In the studio, the audience remained seated even though the show had cut to commercial. They weren't sure whether to leave or stay. What they had witnessed didn't feel like television. It felt like history, the kind you don't realize is historic until later. At the center of it all stood Savannah Guthrie. Her makeup still flawless. Her posture still upright. But the authority was gone. Producers surrounded her now, not deferential, not cautious, but direct. "You crossed a line," one of them said bluntly. "I ask tough questions," she insisted, though her voice no longer carried the same certainty. "That's my job." "Tough questions require evidence," another producer replied. "You made accusations." Savannah looked toward the cameras, now dark, lifeless without their red glow. For a moment, she seemed to shrink in the silence. Across the set, Hoda Kotb sat back down on the orange couch, hands folded in her lap. Her usual warmth had been replaced by something heavier, disappointment. Beside her, Al Roker exhaled sharply. "That wasn't journalism," Al said quietly, not to anyone in particular. "That was personal." At the news desk, Craig Melvin stared at the blank monitor in front of him. He had built his career on measured delivery, controlled tone, careful neutrality. But what had just happened demanded something else. Downstairs, outside the building, the winter air bit at Pedro's cheeks as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The city roared around him, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, unaware that just moments ago a national broadcast had detonated upstairs. His phone buzzed. Once. Twice. Then non-stop. Messages from friends. From colleagues. From people who had been watching live. He didn't look at them yet. Instead, he stood there for a moment, breathing in cold air, letting it cool the lingering heat beneath his skin. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted. He had simply refused to bend. Upstairs, the show returned from commercial without Savannah at the desk. The camera cut back to Hoda, Al, and Craig seated together. The energy had changed completely. The brightness was still there, but it felt artificial now, like sunlight shining through broken glass. Hoda leaned forward slightly, eyes sincere. "We want to address what just happened," she began carefully. There were no cue cards now. No teleprompter guiding her words. Earlier in the show, a conversation escalated in a way that does not reflect the values we aim to uphold. Al nodded beside her. "Guests deserve respect," he added. "Viewers deserve integrity." Craig's voice was steady but firm. "And when lines are crossed, they need to be acknowledged." They didn't mention Savannah by name. They didn't need to. The absence was louder than any statement. In the control room, executives were already drafting internal memos. Damage control strategies. Public statements. The network's legal team had been looped in before the segment even ended. Clips were circulating online at lightning speed, the quota comment, the security demand, Pedro's quiet "yes, it is," before walking away. Within minutes, headlines began forming. Live TV meltdown. Actor walks out after explosive clash. Morning show in crisis. Savannah sat alone in a small conference room down the hall. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, harsher than the studio glow she was accustomed to. For the first time that morning, there were no cameras. No audience. No applause. Just silence. She replayed her own words in her mind. It had started as control. A calculated pivot meant to create headlines. Tough questions create viral moments. Viral moments drive ratings. But somewhere between the first accusation and the security call, control had slipped. And now, there would be consequences. Back on the street, Pedro finally looked at his phone. Messages flooded the screen. "You handled that with grace. We're proud of you. Thank you for standing your ground." He swallowed slowly. The anger was fading now, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. He hadn't walked out to make a statement. But maybe the statement had been necessary. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. His publicist stepped out, face pale. "Are you okay?" she asked. He nodded once. "I'm fine." "You're everywhere right now," she said. "Clips are viral. People are, they're on your side." Pedro looked back up at the building, the glass facade reflecting gray sky and city movement. "I didn't want sides," he murmured. "I just wanted respect." Inside the studio, producers informed Savannah that she would not be returning to the desk for the remainder of the broadcast week pending review. The words hit harder than any on-air confrontation. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no narrative. No audience to sway. Only silence. Hours later, long after the morning show had ended, Pedro sat quietly in his apartment. The city lights flickered beyond his window. He watched a replay of the segment once, not to relive it, but to understand it. He noticed the micro-moments now. The tightening jaw. The hesitation in her eyes when the audience clapped. The exact second the energy shifted in the room. He turned the screen off. He didn't need to watch it again. The next morning, official statements were released. The network acknowledged the inappropriate framing of questions. An internal review was underway. Savannah's statement was shorter. In the heat of live television, emotions ran high. "I regret the tone of the exchange." It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was the beginning of accountability. And for Pedro, that was enough. Because what mattered most had already happened. He had walked into a hostile moment. He had been baited, cornered, challenged. And instead of losing control, he had drawn a line. Days later, when he finally returned to promoting his film, the conversation was different. Interviewers asked about resilience. About dignity. About handling pressure. And he answered the same way each time. "I believe in treating people with respect," he said simply. That's it. No grand speeches. No victory lap. Just clarity. The clip of him walking away, head high, voice steady, continued circulating online. It became less about scandal and more about composure. In the end, the moment that was meant to diminish him had done the opposite. It had revealed character. And as for the morning show, it continued. It always does. Television moves on. But viewers don't forget. The bright lights will blaze again tomorrow. The orange couch will host new guests. Smiles will return. Scripts will be followed. Yet somewhere in that studio, the memory lingers, a reminder that live television is unpredictable, that power can unravel, and that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't shouted. It's spoken calmly. And followed by walking away. If this story gripped you, if you felt the tension, the silence, the turning of the tide. Make sure you like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more cinematic breakdowns of the most explosive moments in live television. Because sometimes, the real drama isn't scripted. It's broadcast live.